You know, Alex, I spent 3 days last week prepping a live edge cherry slab. I'm talking sanding until my fingerprints were nearly gone, sealing every tiny pinhole, the works. I poured the deep set resin late Friday night, thinking I'd wake up to a glass smooth masterpiece.
Oh no, I know that tiger sigh. What did you find on Saturday morning?
I walked into the shop and it looked like someone had breathed on a cold window pane, and it just stayed that way. It was cloudy, greasy, and had this weird, waxy film on top. It looked more like a bowl of cold gravy than a high-end table.
Cold gravy is not exactly the aesthetic people pay four figures for. What happened? Did you forget to mix it?
No, the mix was spot on. The culprit was a late-night thunderstorm that rolled through. The humidity spiked to about 90% while I was sleeping. I essentially turned my workshop into a giant humidor, and the epoxy hated every second of it.
It's wild how something as invisible as water vapor can just wreck a project. Today on the Tiger Den, we're peeling back the curtain on the two silent killers of a good pour, temperature and humidity. Because apparently, Tiger, you're still learning how to check the weather app.
Hey, when the creative muse strikes, I tend to ignore the barometer, but the science doesn't ignore us. When you mix part A and part B, you aren't just stirring liquid, you're kickstarting a chemical marriage. And like any marriage, if the atmosphere is too tense, or in this case, too wet, things go south fast.
So, let's start with the basics for the folks at home. We talk about humidity like it's just mugginess. But what is it actually doing to the resin while it sits there in the mold?
Think of epoxy as a giant sponge while it's in that liquid open time. Humidity is the measure of water vapor in the air. If the air is packed with moisture, the epoxy starts absorbing it. That leads to what we call blushing. It's that oily, sticky, waxy surface I found on my cherry table. The moisture reacts with the hardener and creates a carbamate film.
That sounds like a fancy way of saying you have to sand it all off and start over.
Exactly. And it's not just the look. If you're doing multiple pours, that oily blush prevents the next layer from bonding. It's like trying to tape something to a piece of wax paper. It just won't stick.
Okay, but I've seen people use heat to get rid of bubbles. Doesn't heat help? If it's a hot, humid day, shouldn't the hot part be a good thing for the cure?
It's a double-edged sword, Alex. Woodworkers love a warm shop because epoxy flows better when it's warm, like honey in the sun. But if it's too hot, the reaction goes into overdrive. We call that an exothermic reaction. The resin starts generating its own heat so fast, it can actually smoke, crack, or even foam up like a bad chemistry fair project.
So there's a Goldilocks zone here. What's the magic number where the resin is happy and you aren't crying into your sawdust?
You want to aim for that 22 to 25 degrees Celsius range. That's roughly 72 to 77 degrees Fahrenheit for the folks still using the old yardsticks. And humidity? Keep it under 50% if you can. If you walk into your shop and your shirt is sticking to your back, just put the jugs down. Walk away. Go get an iced tea.
Put the jugs down. Solid advice. But what if you're like most of us, and your shop is actually a garage or a basement where you can't exactly flick a switch and get laboratory conditions?
That's where you have to get sneaky. I've started running a dehumidifier 24 hours before I even think about opening a bottle of resin. You have to pull the moisture out of the air and the wood itself before you start.
Wait, air conditioning works too, right?
It does, but you have to be careful. You want standard AC, not an evaporative cooler, what some people call swamp coolers. Those things literally work by pumping moisture into the air. Using a swamp cooler during an epoxy pour is like trying to put out a fire with a can of gasoline.
Let's talk about the timeline. Humidity doesn't just attack at the beginning, right? Does it matter once the stuff starts to harden?
Oh, it's a predator. It watches for the initial cure phase. That's when the liquid starts to turn into a gel. It's still tacky, kind of like the back of a piece of masking tape. If the temperature swings wildly during that phase, say the sun goes down and your shop drops 20 degrees, you're asking for trouble. Condensation can form right on the surface.
Is that why some pours end up looking cloudy inside, not just on the surface?
Spot on. If you get moisture trapped during the pour, or if you're using pigments that aren't compatible, it's game over for clarity. And here's a little secret. Check your additives. If you're dumping in more than 10% ink or acrylic paint, you're changing the chemistry. Some of those paints have water in them. You're literally stirring the enemy into your project.
So you're saying I can't just dump a whole tube of ocean blue acrylic from the craft store into my $200 resin?
I mean, you can if you want your table to look like a blue marshmallow, but if you want that deep, crystalline sapphire look, you have to be precise. Epoxy is a jealous mistress. She wants her ratios exact. Part A and Part B are non-negotiable. If you try to speed up the cure by adding extra hardener, you aren't being clever. You're just making a sticky mess that will never fully harden.
You mentioned leaving resin in a confined space as a heat risk. I think I've seen videos of people's mixing cups literally melting.
I may or may not have a permanent ring burned into one of my old workbenches from a gallon-sized mixing bucket that went nuclear. When the resin is all bunched up in a deep pot, the heat can't escape. It feeds on itself. The center gets hot, which makes the reaction faster, which makes it even hotter. It's a runaway train.
So the pro move is to spread it out?
Get it out of the bucket and onto the project as soon as it's mixed. Once it's in a thin layer, that heat can dissipate into the air and the wood. It's all about surface area.
Okay, let's recap for the person who's currently standing in their garage, looking at a puddle of resin and a weather report that says thunderstorms. What's the checklist?
First, stabilize the room. Get a cheap hygrometer. You can find them for $10. If it says 65% humidity or higher, don't pour. Second, check your material temp. If your resin has been sitting on a cold concrete floor, it's going to be full of bubbles because it's too thick. Bring it inside the house the night before. Warm resin is happy resin.
And the blush? If someone wakes up to that oily film we talked about, is the project a total loss?
Not necessarily. If it's just a surface blush, you can wash it with warm soapy water and a Scotch-Brite pad, let it dry completely, and sand it back. But you've got to be thorough. If you leave even a thumbprint of that wax behind, your next coat will peel off like a bad sunburn.
You have a real gift for appetizing metaphors today, Tiger. Gravy and sunburns.
I speak from the heart, Alex, and from a very expensive pile of learning opportunities in the corner of my shop.
I think the biggest takeaway here is that woodworking, and especially epoxy work, isn't just about the tools you hold in your hand. It's about the environment you're standing in. You can't fight physics.
You really can't. You have to work with the air, not against it. My best pours now? They happen on those crisp, clear fall days when the air is dry and the shop is a steady 70 degrees. It's boring, but boring is beautiful when you're looking for a perfect finish.
Boring is better than cold gravy.
Every single time.
This was a deep one. If you're listening and you've got a shop disaster story of your own, maybe a resin pour that went rogue or a humidity nightmare, we want to hear it.
Just don't tell me you tried to use a hairdryer to cure it in a rainstorm. I might actually have a heart attack. Keep your shops dry and your ratios tight, folks. We'll see you next time in the den.